In today's video, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Forza Horizon 5's photo mode and what exactly do all these sliders mean. To make things easier, I've added my controller overlay over here so you can see exactly the kind of buttons I'm pressing. And I'm going to try my best in explaining what every single one of these sliders actually do, and also run through my settings that I use when I take photos in Forza Horizon 5. Whilst we're here, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone that watched and support the previous video on photo locations in Forza Horizon 5. And after reading through the comments, it was quite clear to me that I needed to make a video on photo settings and the settings I use, as well as explaining what all of this stuff actually means. With that being said, let's just get straight into the video. So just before we get started, and you're wondering why am I listening to this dude explain to me how to take photos in Forza Horizon 5, well, to give you a little bit of context, I'm actually a photographer and videographer myself. If you'd like to see some of the photos that I shoot in real life, then make sure to head over to my Instagram. I've got a ton of photos in there, and especially photos of cars. So just to make this easier, I've gone ahead and reset everything to defaults over here into my preset so that we're both on the same page. So talking about Forza Horizon 5, let's start with shutter speed. Shutter speed is literally how long the shutter is going to remain open for when you take the photo. So if you have a shutter open for longer, that means you have more time to capture moving images. So in Forza terms, that would be 100. 100 is the maximum you can go to, and that would be the most amount of time your shutter can be open when taking a photo. Now let me explain this by showing you an example. Shutter speed is important when we're talking about moving images. So let me just get some speed over here and go into photo mode. Now once we're in photo mode, you can see with 100 shutter speed, we've got the shutter open at maximum time here, and we can see a lot of things moving in the background. Now that's because the focus mode is on tracking, and now you got to imagine as if you were in another car following this car at the same speed and focused on the car. Now if you were to go and focus on the tree, you can almost see that the car is just a blur. Now this is because Forza thinks you're now on your feet and you're in line with the tree and you're going at the same speed as the tree. So going back to focusing on the car, we're back in that car, we're back in that virtual car following the car, and everywhere your camera goes, you're still with the car. So think about this as you're almost connected to the car in this photo mode. If we turn the shutter speed right down to 0, it's going to capture everything in real time. And this goes back to me explaining how the shutter speed now at 0 is just going so quickly that it's just capturing it in motion. And so just to recap, having a longer shutter speed at 100 like so will allow you to capture the car in motion, but a shutter speed at 0 will take the picture of the car right there, right then, with absolutely no delay whatsoever, with everything still. So once we've covered the shutter speed, now we know that, we can really build that element of speed through the shutter. Having this at higher numbers like this gives you the real sense of speed that this car is moving at. But that's not the only way we can actually make this look like it's going fast. Now remember when I said the focus mode tracking means you're connected to the car. Now if you change this to panning, it now means that you're stood on the road with camera, panning your camera, trying to take a photo of this car. So you're not connected to the car anymore, hence why you get photos like this. So there we have it. If you want to have a car and if you want to make it seem that it's going really fast, you can go over to panning and really play around the settings. But you can also do that in tracking. It just depends on the kind of shot that you're going for. Okay, so moving on to the next one, focus. I'm going to come back to this because I need to first explain aperture before we get into focus. So let's skip to exposure. Exposure over here is really just going to dial in how much light hits the camera. So if you imagine it at 100%, you're just bringing in the maximum amount of light into the camera and your image is going to be overexposed. Now, if you do the same on the other side, you're really struggling to get light into the camera and your image is underexposed. So the exposure is really, really important to make sure that you're balancing the image correctly so that you're not overexposed or not underexposed. So rather than setting this into the middle, I always tend to underexpose my images just a little bit, because that helps me then to really add in some more detail in the contrast, color, and brightness tabs later on. So just to sum it up again, a higher number just means there's more light coming into the camera, and a lower number just means there's less light coming into the camera. Now, the best way to explain aperture is that aperture works in a similar way to exposure. The lower the number on aperture, the more in focus, and the higher the number in aperture, the less there is in focus. And if you have a really high number on the aperture, that means you can be really specific with where you focus. For example, I focused on the number 4 in here, and everything else is pretty much out of focus. I wouldn't really recommend this unless that's something that you want to do. Yeah, that's essentially aperture. Now let's go back to talking about focus. Let's leave this at 100%, so we're really specific with our current focal point, which is on number 4, and we're going to start playing around with the slider on focus. Now, if I move this all the way up to 100, we can start to see that the trees are now in focus. The reason I know that, and the reason why they don't look they're in focus, is because the shutter speed is high. So let's lower that right down to 0. And now we can really start to see that the trees are in focus. That's because having the focus all the way on the right just means you have the focus all the way at the back. So anything that is far back into the frame is going to be in focus. Now, if we start moving that all the way in the front, anything that's right in the front is going to be right in focus. So this is what you can do to kind of move that focal point away from that 4. So as you can see here, the rear tire is now in focus, and I know that 37 has that in the focal length, and I don't have to refocus my shot. If I move this all the way down to 31, 32, I can start to see that the rim is now in focus over here. And so that's really my best way of explaining focus, is that you can use the slider to shift around the image depending on where you actually want to focus. You can then obviously change your aperture right down, so you're not being very tight and strict with the aperture. But say something like 40 over here, we go down to this and we focus on the tire, we can see that we've got the entire rim in focus and everything else behind it is a blur. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that explains what focus does, and so far it explains what all of these terms actually mean. So next thing we're going to talk about is the bokeh shape, or bokeh, or however you pronounce it. I'm not really sure. This really just determines what shape the out of focus element is going to be when it's out of focus. So as you can see over here, we've got this light, kind of like a reflection on the car, and it's a circle. That's because our bokeh shape is set to circle. If we change that to diamond, you'll now start to see it change into a diamond. One thing I will mention is that you want to up this to quality instead of fast. That will just give you a much crispier shot like this one over here, and you can really start to see the hexagon. If we take this back to circle, you'll start to see the circle. And if I just hide this for a second, you'll really start to understand that. I'm sure everyone knows what a bokeh is. It's just a word that doesn't really get used a lot, but we've seen it everywhere. I mean, if you look at Christmas lights, for example, and take a photo on your phone of someone and there's lights in the background, usually it'll go into a circle and it'll just be, blurry. And so that's really just what bokeh is. You can change it to any shape that you want. Doesn't really matter what it is, but depending on the scenario, you might want to have it at diamond, you might want to have it to be a pentagon or a hexagon. That is totally up to you. So the best way to explain contrast is just that it's the contrast between white and black in the image. So that would be the highlights and the shadows of the image. If we take the contrast all the way up, you're going to be having a much greater contrast between the blacks and the whites in the image, hence causing this really intense, dark, kind of moody image. Whereas if you take it to the other side, it starts to go really faded. That's because there's a lot more highlights involved here, and the shadows have just been cranked up. So it's really important, actually, in contrast, to always get it right. Now, if you do have to take your contrast that high up, you can compensate that by adding brightness to it. All of these things only really start to take an effect if you're taking pictures at nighttime, where you do have to play with contrast and balance it with brightness. I would say stick to the basics, keep this at default levels unless you need to change it. There's really little to no adjustments that I would do in the contrast, color, and brightness tab. I probably use the color tab a lot more than I do brightness and contrast, because brightness and contrast are some things that you're going to use a lot when it comes to nighttime photography or photography in low light. And if you guys would like to see a video on me explaining how I take photos at nighttime, then please let me know in the comments, because that's going to require a video in itself. So moving on to color, if we increase the color on here, it will just increase the overall saturation of the image. So having it at 100 just means the color has just been bumped up by 100% to give you the maximum amount of color. And moving back down to 0 just means it takes away all of the color. So again, in an ideal world, you'll be sitting right in the middle, but I do tend to take this up to about 60 just to add in a little bit more saturation and give it that punchy feel. Now, what Sepia does to your image is it actually gives you a vintage look. Now, if you're taking a photo of a really classic car and want to get that vintage look, then taking this up a notch, I wouldn't recommend going to 100. You're going to get that warm black and white sort of feel. So you really need to find the right balance here if you're going to take that shot. Now let's talk about vignettes. Vignette is literally the black edges that you currently see around the screen. Having this at 100% gives you this effect. And this really comes down to personal preference. You can change the vignette style so that it's only on the side, so that's only on the top, or if it's kind of in this shape over here. And it, again, like I said, this is personal preference. I personally do not use vignetting at all. I'm not a fan of it, and I really don't like having dark images around the image. The only time I would add vignette is when I'm actually editing my photos and I need to add a black gradient. And here's an example I can show you of a few cars that I've added that to in Forza Horizon 4. So the temperature slider in here just determines how warm or cold your image is. Now, to explain that a little bit further, a warm image just means having the temperature higher. So imagine that if the temperature goes up, the image gets warmer and you start to see a really sunny look. Whereas if you go on to the other side, it starts to get colder, it starts to get a little bit frosty, and you can get a little bit more moody on this. So I'm not really sure if this is something that you've paid too much attention to. If you see in movies, for example, you'll often see a really warm tone when things are happy, when things are mellow, or when things are calm. But you'll tend to see a lot of colder images when things are a bit scary, or things are a bit unknown, or there's a chase scene happening. The next tabs here are really just self-explanatory. Car lights, whether you want them on and off, drivers enabled or disabled, although you can't turn drivers off when the car is moving. The crowd is something that you can disable if you're near the festival. And creatures, again, if you don't want any animals in the shot, you can disable that as well. So as standard, when you go into photo mode, your zoom will be at 1. Now that's fine, and you can take images at this, but I always prefer to just go a little bit more to about 1.8, and this can vary just to give it a little bit more compression and to get the car in a nicer format. This is just my overall kind of preference, and this very much depends on you. You could go all the way out to 0.5 and have the car really wide, and honestly, this could look really cool for having portrait images. Now, I can't really see that, but if you were to flip this around, that could look quite cool for a phone wallpaper, for example. So the way I do that is just left or right on the D-pad to change the roll on the camera, and that you can see right there on the right hand side of the screen. By moving the right stick, you can go up and down. By moving the left stick, you can go left and right. And by using the triggers, you can go up and down. I should have probably mentioned this at the start, but I'll keep that in mind for next time. I would then focus on the car over here. And I've just done the worst thing you could ever do. And I'm glad I got this recorded. I'm not sure if you guys saw what I did there, but I tried to focus on the car whilst I was in this menu. Now the problem is, if you click on X to focus on the car. In this screen, focus on the car. But if you click X in this screen, so let me go in here, for example, in terms of like a preset, and press X, you reset all of your values to default. So please, 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 please make sure that you always keep in mind, and just don't repeat the mistake I did just now in terms of actually pressing X when you're not onto that screen, because it will reset everything and you're gonna have to go through all of these settings again and just dial them in. It's a pain in the ass sometimes, but if you know what you're doing, then it shouldn't take you too long to figure it out and get that shot once again. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then make sure you drop a like, comment down below if you found this useful, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and make sure you turn on notifications so you never miss a video into the future. There's going to be a lot more Forza Horizon 5 content coming out, and if you'd like to see a video on how I edit my photos, then please drop a like, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll make sure to post that next. If you'd like to see my previous Forza Horizon 5 video on photo locations, then make sure you click here. If you'd like to see a really random video, and I guarantee you want to watch this, click here. Seriously, the video is going to end now. Click here, click here.